How do you bring two warring sides together? The situation between Israel and the Palestinians is worse than it's been for years, but at some stage there will probably have to be talks. Here we look at whether outsiders can possibly help, whether they can actually make matters worse. The art of bringing enemies closer. This is Roundtable. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm David Foster. The calls for a lasting ceasefire grow louder as Israeli airstrikes continue to pound targets and dozens of Hamas rockets are fired from Gaza. Residential buildings, roads, power lines, they've all been destroyed in Gaza, the densely populated Palestinian territory under Israeli blockade. Hamas rockets have been fired at Israeli cities, including Ashkelon and Beersheba. Israel says 90% of those weapons have been intercepted by its defense system. So what about diplomacy? And does the European Union have a plan other than to decry the violence? Well, we start a long way from where a lot of the trouble is, but where some of the answers might be found. In Brussels, we see Peter Stano, the lead spokesperson for foreign affairs and security policy at the European Commission. What does the EU have in mind? In London, James Watt, former British diplomat. He was ambassador to Lebanon, to Jordan, and to Egypt. And lastly, Hugh Lovett, policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, who has helped the European Union work on its Middle East policy, although, Hugh, I know you say unofficially. More on that in just a moment. Pete, let me come to you first of all. It's been described by your office as a grave escalation, that the EU is dismayed, that the priority must be to protect civilians. Fine words, but what's actually being done to make that happen?
Well, indeed, this is a worrying escalation of the situation and of the violence in the region, and this is something we want to see to be stopped as soon as possible. That's why all the public calls and statements by the European Union and by the officials and representatives of the European Union have been focusing on this. The priority is to stop the violence and to protect civilians. And what's behind this? I mean, behind public declarations, there is a lot of diplomatic efforts going on. Since the recent confrontation started between the militants in Gaza Strip and Israeli army, there have been a lot of efforts, a lot of contacts by the diplomats, both from the EU side, but also from the individual member states of the European Union. Let's not forget that the EU is 27 member states, 27 foreign ministers.
Which could be part of the problem as well as a good thing, in your opinion. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But, OK, first of all, you repeated the sentiment that it had to stop. Then you said there's a lot of diplomatic toing and froing. But tell us in concrete terms what is actually happening. Who's doing something here?
Well, everyone who has a place, who has a role to play, plays the role. The High Representative, for example, Josep Borrell, the top EU diplomat, is in touch with his counterparts, both in the EU and in the region, to see how we can contribute, how we as the European Union can contribute to ending the current wave of violence.
Let me quote Josep Borrell at this point, reaching out to regional actors to contribute to de-escalation. That was one of his tweets. Which regional actors? Is it Jordan? Is it Egypt? Who?
Well, it's basically everyone who has something to say or to do in that region. So starting with the Israelis, he was in touch with the Israeli foreign minister, with the Palestinian president. He was in touch with the foreign minister of Egypt and many others. So this is part of the diplomatic work. You have to talk to partners at the international stage because, you know, with the problems such as the Middle Eastern peace process or absence of the peace process, you cannot do anything yourself. You have to team up with the partners to achieve a change in the current course of events. And right now, the priority really is to stop the unacceptable wave of confrontation and of violence.
OK, so James Watt, let me come to you. You've been an ambassador in a number of Middle Eastern countries, Egypt being one of them, and Egypt's often been used as a conduit in the Middle East peace process. You're at all encouraged by anything you've heard?
Yes, I think Egypt does play an important role. I think it's playing an important role now. The Israelis do listen to them because the cooperation on Gaza in particular has, over the years, been pretty strong. But I think it's important that all governments recognize, and they do recognize, that their public opinion is very incensed about what they're seeing on their screens, the bombardment of Gaza, which is now continuing into a second week. I think it's really very strong. There's a very strong message coming from public opinion in this country, in Britain, and in Arab countries and in European countries, which their governments have to endorse.
But I suppose my question really is anybody listening to what the EU is saying, whether it be Egypt, whether it be Lebanon, whether it be Jordan, is anybody taking a blind bit of notice of one of the biggest actors in the region, but possibly one of the least influential?
Yes, but I think nobody's claiming, an overwhelming advantage for EU diplomacy. But yes, it is an important voice, and if it were absent, it would count very strongly against efforts to make peace, bring an end to the violence. And I think Europe has had a consistent position to support fair and just outcome for whatever settlement is reached between the Palestinians and the Israelis by negotiation. And there's always been a two-state solution now, and that could continue. It could modify itself. I don't know, but I think the Israelis carry on doing what they want, but they can't totally ignore the fact that public opinion globally, and particularly in Europe, where they have many close friends, is building very strongly against this continuing bombardment of civilian populations.
I'll come back to you, James, if I may, and ask about the role that a country such as Egypt can play in mediating a crisis such as this, and your role in other countries as well. But Hugh, former Jordan Foreign Minister Marwan Muasher, let's take a look at one of the things that he had to say. This was about the European Union paying lip service to the two-state solution without accompanying it with a clear plan to make it happen, has essentially given Israel a green light to continue building settlements and creating new facts on the ground that will make such a solution unattainable. He's pretty jaundiced in his view about what the European Union either has done in the past or could do in the future. Where do you stand on that?
And he's not the only one. And as someone who does believe in a strong EU foreign policy, this is particularly frustrating, especially when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because I think there is a real EU value added, which I'll come to in 1 second. But I think Marwan Muasher is right, that in my view, the EU has prioritized the preservation of a failed political strategy, which is the Oslo peace process, which over decades has shown itself unable to deliver peace, but also unable to manage the conflict. Yet the EU continues to cheerlead that and to prioritize that peace process's survival. And that has come at the expense of actual real measures to drive forward prospects of reaching a two-state solution. So, one example is why not recognize Palestine? And obviously the EU will say that's not its competence. But
hey, stop a minute, because that's on my list of questions for Peter. So we'll throw it to you, Peter. Why not recognize Palestine?
Well, this is something what is in the competence of individual member states. The EU as institution has no power to recognize or derecognize something or someone. So the recognition of states, recognition of governments and heads of states is purely national competence. You know that in the EU there are already member states which recognized Palestine. There are some which consider it, but this is not something for the EU. That's individual decision by the member states.
Is that copping out, Hugh?
So obviously that is correct. But what I was going to say is, so when you turn to the French, for example, and I'm not just picking on them, this is other countries, the UK, who have not yet recognized Palestine. Their reason for doing that, one of their reasons, is that actually can't do anything to help advance peace and actually will undermine negotiations. And that's my point, is that actually, again, the EU has prioritized, and its member states have prioritized the peace process, which no longer exists, negotiations, which are currently inaccessible, and even if you could get the sides around the table, would not actually lead to anything. That this has come at the expense of actual real political capital, spending real political capital to create the conditions necessary for a viable process. This means, working on the Palestinian side to get their house in order, stopping the current authoritarianism of the Palestinian Authority and Abbas, which the EU is now funding, but also changing the cost-benefit calculations on the Israeli side that currently lean towards continued occupation. And in that regard, in both its relations towards the Palestinians and its relations towards Israel, the EU does actually have real leverage. It just does not want to use it.
Well, it's the leverage I want to talk about right now. And I want both you and James, if you don't mind, Hugh, to save this one for Peter in just a moment. Where do you think the leverage can come from? Peter, my question to you is, I think Israel gets 90+% of its arms from overseas from the United States, but he gets a fair proportion of the remainder from countries such as France. Is it the job of the European Union to put pressure on individual countries to stop selling to a country that's carrying out the kind of atrocities we are hearing about in Gaza?
Well, the EU is organization based on consensus. So we are, as institution, we are not pressuring the member states. I mean, we are in the hands of the member states. So the EU institutions do whatever member states agree on. In case of foreign policy, it's exactly the case. So the EU foreign policy is the result of unanimous decision by the member states. So if we are discussing whether the two-state solution is still realistic or not anymore, I mean, the EU's position about the two-state solution is based on the consensus of all the member states that, as until now, they don't see any better alternative. When we have the special extraordinary discussion of the foreign ministers of the EU, maybe there will be other ideas and maybe the member states will decide to move in different direction. But so far, there is no better alternative to two-state solution. And the member states agreed to have this position. If member states agree to do something else, then the EU will proceed in this direction.
Okay, so James, you've got 27 different countries all trying to reach one particular conclusion. It sounds like a camel, doesn't it? Designed by committee, and it doesn't really look that good.
I agree with you that the EU could do far more. It needs to be far more clear-sighted about the consequences of the delays, the inertia, the total lack of any success in moving things forward, and thereby averting the repetition of this kind of violence that we're seeing. And I think it requires a more strategic approach. It requires greater political courage, which doesn't mean the courage to be confrontational with Israel or with Palestine or with anybody, but simply courage to recognize that we are sitting on our hands at the moment.
Peter, do you want to reply to that?
Well, exactly, and this is what the High Representative Josep Borrell is saying. I mean, we have, if we want, we have the leverage, we have all the necessary leverage to put also some weight and some pressure, if necessary, behind our words, declarations, and principles.
But please, again, just tell me what that leverage is. What can you do to stop this happening?
When we speak specifically about this, of course, it's the political pressure. We have instruments, we have instruments like deals, investment, economic relations, individual bilateral relations by the member states with both Palestinians and Israelis. So if we decide to use this as a leverage, we could achieve the necessary
results. Well, why not do it now?
As I said, well, that's a good question to 27 member states. If they are not able to find consensus, they need to justify it with whatever they come up with. Foreign ministers, they will discuss the way forward. Maybe this all what we are witnessing now, and that's unacceptable. I think everyone agrees.
I suppose what you're saying is it could work if it was allowed to work, but it can't work because it's an impossible job for 27 different people to do. So it won't work.
Well, I mean, it's question of principle of unanimity versus qualified majority decision taking. So this is the eternal discussion right now when it comes to foreign policy positions and decisions. Are we going to get rid of unanimity, and are we going to start taking decisions by qualified majority? So far, there's no willingness by the member states.
Okay, so let's go to Hugh and to James on this one. James, you with Egypt and Jordan in this, is it time for the major players in the Middle East to start putting pressure on Hamas, Islamic Jihad, other groups within Gaza, and on Israel to bring this to an end, rather than big bodies like the EU, which is, in a sense, sort of at arm's length?
Well, I think Egypt has got major problems with the Islamists in Gaza Strip. And they deal with Hamas, but they're obviously not happy with Islamic Jihad or with the violence. I think they're very effective. They control the gate from Gaza into Egypt, which they use as a very effective lever. And I think people listen to them. But of course, Hamas has been offering a ceasefire now for several days. So it's not a question of persuading Hamas. It's a question of persuading the Israelis that this kind of hardline tactic, which they repeatedly used in 2014 was the last time, is very unproductive in the sense that you're just going to be in a cycle like this, which does Israel no good. It does its security, its peace, its happiness no good at all. That really a search must begin for a wider, deeper answer to this. Engaging populations in Israel, in Palestine, around the world, who sincerely want to support, a kind of a formula, a model, which enables the minority, in case of Israel, the Arab Israeli minority, to be fully respected and given its rights in the context of a Jewish majority Israel. And then for Israel to treat its neighbors in the form of the Palestinians elsewhere with all the due respect and respect for law and human rights that they deserve.
So, Hugh, where do you go other than countries like Egypt to get some kind of end to this?
As we've heard, I think the mediators are already well known and have a track record, and I think it's more about a process of supporting them. I think Egypt is the first one, as we've heard, and I think obviously the UN mission there is also extremely instrumental and has experience in brokering ceasefires. And then obviously you have Qatar, which is also an important interlocutor and as a funder of projects in Gaza and a funder of actually ceasefire arrangements. And perhaps the Emirates in terms of their newfound leverage with Israel, which they've yet to deploy, but one can always hope. But I do want to make just an important point, which is we're having this discussion in part because the EU has chosen to self-marginalize itself, especially when it comes to Gaza. And, to leap to Peter's defense for an instant, clearly the whole burden cannot be on Josep Borrell, the European Commission, and yes, this is a product and the decision of 27 member states. But nonetheless, if the EU cannot play a role in Gaza, there is a reason, and it's a reason of the EU's own making, in terms of, as we talked about, not willing to really deploy leverage vis-a-vis Israel, but also taking a purposeful policy not to have any contact with Hamas, and therefore not develop any relations or means of influencing that movement and binding it to a political or diplomatic process.
Peter, the EU might have been better employed by building up some kind of trust with Hamas. Why wouldn't you do that?
Well, first of all, Hamas is a terrorist organization, so it's kind of difficult, to negotiate with terrorists first.
But as Hugh said, he said he worked behind the scenes for the European Union. There's backdoor diplomacy and there's overt diplomacy. So you don't have to like them. You don't have to be seen to be talking to them.
Exactly, and this is what I was saying already at the start, that we are trying to be engaged with everyone who can play a role, who plays a role, or who can exercise an influence on the main actors. So this is the nature of the EU's diplomatic engagement. So even though we are not talking directly to someone, it doesn't mean that we are not talking to someone else who can talk to that particular person or actor. So this is very complex exercise. But as I said, the red lines for us and the limits are the positions which are agreed by all the 27 member states and defined by their ambitions, how much they want the EU to achieve in such very important issue, international issues such as Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I can assure you that the High Representative Josep Borrell wants to move this, wants to advance it. And that's why he is arguing for the qualified majority voting so that the EU can finally really play its role, its strong role, because the EU is a power, but we are soft power and we refrain from applying maybe the harder means which are at our disposal.
Well, the United Nations is supposed to be a major power in the world. As we come towards the end, we're going to hear from Antonio Guterres, who's the Secretary General of that organization.
The current hostilities are utterly appalling. This latest round of violence only perpetuates the cycles of death, destruction and despair, and pushes farther to the horizon any hopes of coexistence and peace. Fighting must stop.
And again, it is just fine words, isn't it? Asking for a ceasefire, saying this, that, and the other. The United Nations hasn't really done anything. So once again, my question to you, Peter, is if you have to talk to unpalatable people, can you get them backdoor diplomacy, somebody talking to somebody to somebody else, etc., as you alluded to? Is that likely to work?
Well, we have to try all the avenues that we have, all the channels that we have, because the alternative is not doing anything and just watch and see the events unfolding. The recent events in Gaza and around Gaza are showing how important it is to finally start to deal with the root causes. So what we are saying, priority now is to stop fighting, find solutions, how to restart the peace talks, the direct negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis, because this is the only way out of the now endless cycle of violence. So, and for that, we are trying to use all the venues, avenues, and channels. But again, it's not only the EU who has responsibilities here. This needs to be collective international effort.
Well, we can talk about the role the United States has got in this at this particular point, because, James, I was going to ask you about trust and how easy, well, actually how difficult it is to build up trust and maintain trust. The Deputy Secretary General of the State Department, Secretary of State, I beg your pardon, Hadi Amr, is in the region. He's working for President Biden. He's trying to sort of get the sides together. And how do you think the Palestinian side and the Israeli side will take something that he said in 2002. We will never, never forget what the Israeli people, the Israeli military, and the Israeli democracy have done to Palestinian children, and there will be thousands who will seek to avenge these brutal murders of innocents. If you're a Palestinian, you might think he's a good guy to have on your side. If you're an Israeli, you might think he's not somebody I really want to trust or to talk to. It's impossible, isn't it, to build up and keep trust?
It's an interesting question, why he was chosen to lead this mission. I'm sure President Biden had his, and Lincoln had their good reasons. But you're right, it doesn't sound like exactly he's totally on Israel's side. But maybe that's the message that the United States is trying to send, saying to Israel, you know, we do support you, but we don't support you in this. And it really is time you started getting more strategic about finding a solution to this endless cycle of violence.
Hugh, do you think there will be pressure enough to be able to be put on Israel from somebody such as this and fire him, the President of the United States? Is that where it has to come from?
So I think clearly moving Israel into a position where it would be open to ceasefire negotiations, which does not appear to yet have happened, I think that clearly is an important American deliverable, and it goes obviously beyond Hadi Amr. And I haven't seen evidence really. I mean, obviously we don't see everything that happens behind closed doors, but there's no evidence yet that the American administration has said enough is enough, and that has to happen. And just on a very quick point, you know, again, the Americans suffer from the same issue of not talking to Hamas, and so Hadi will talk to the Israeli government, but he'll also talk to the Palestinian Authority and President Mahmoud Abbas, who has absolutely zero capacity to influence what's happening in Gaza.
Listen, I don't know how much longer we've got on the programme, but I just want to recount a story that perhaps illustrates how difficult it's going to be. I was with a veteran BBC correspondent back in, it's probably about the mid-80s in Nablus, and there were some stones being thrown and some return fire of whatever from the Israelis. And this correspondent said, he said, I'm quitting. He said, I was watching their grandparents doing this 25, 30 years ago. He said, and if I stay here, I'll still be watching their grandchildren doing the same thing. Now, those grandchildren are probably the parents of those who are out on the streets at the moment. It does not ever end. Quick question to each of you. If it could be a yes, that would be absolutely fine. Do you think it'll ever be possible to bring peace to the Middle East, Hugh?
I think it is absolutely possible, but we are not on that trajectory. We are moving in a direction that is towards the consolidation of open-ended occupation, conflict, and unequal rights. And we need to get off that. And to get off that, we need a better peacemaking strategy.
We have more time than I thought, James, so you can expand on your thoughts. What will it take?
Yes, it will take that. It could take a long time. I think there's a generational change. I also think that it's very difficult to control public opinion as it used to be controlled, particularly in the Arab world, by limiting access to news stories, because social media now can transmit immediately in great detail, in very personal detail, what is actually going on and what people are saying and protesting about and chanting and doing. So I think those dynamics are already beginning to change the situation. I have to be confident. I do believe in the end there can be a solution. It's going to take several stages and steps, though, but we must start.
Peter, does this bombing of the Al Jazeera AP building in Gaza indicate that Israel is susceptible to pressure from the outside world? That if the AP or Al Jazeera or whoever happens to write something that affects public opinion, Israel feels the need to shut it down?
Well, I wouldn't like to speculate on Israel's motivations in this particular case. I mean, for us, it's very clear the media needs to have ensured their safety of their people, and it's very important that independent reporting is preserved, especially in the situation.
But again, that's just fine words. I'm asking you for an opinion.
Well, again, it's not about opinion, what we think or not. For us, it's really, really highly concerning that media are being targeted. But again, I'm not going to speculate about motivations by the Israelis. We want this conflict to be solved. We hope, also based on the European history, that it can be solved. I mean, we were bitter enemies inside Europe, and now we reconciled and live and work together. So hopefully it will be possible for the region as well. But it's in the end up to the Israelis and Palestinians to make it work. No one from outside will be able to impose it, because in the end, it's them living side by side. So it's in their interest, and they will have to do it.
Listen, thank you very, very much indeed. Peter Stano talking on behalf of the European Commission's foreign policy. We appreciate your time. Thank you very much, James Watt, and Hugh Lovett also. For what it's worth, going back to that last point about trying to silence the media in Gaza, it's a building that I've worked out of on a number of occasions, never seen any evidence in the times that I've been there of any kind of weaponry in it. It is a media building, and looking at what happened the other day when that fell over, I could see, well, they were worried about what the people in that building might be reporting on. And what they were reporting on was the truth about what was actually happening inside Gaza, best described in many cases as an open-air prison. From me, David Foster, from my guests on this roundtable, we thank you very much for watching. Hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.